Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a battle that's often framed as a heroic stand against foreign invaders. But what if that's only half the story? What if the legendary Battle of Clontarf wasn't so much Ireland versus the Vikings, but Irishmen versus Irishmen, caught in a web of alliances, ambitions, and clashing systems of power? To understand what really happened in the year 1014, we have to step back, way back, to a time when Ireland wasn't a single country but a patchwork of fiercely independent kingdoms. Picture a map not of borders, but of rival clans, local kings, and temporary alliances that could turn from friendship to blood feud in a single generation. This was medieval Ireland, politically fluid, endlessly entangled, and deeply resistant to centralized authority. There was no single ruler. Instead, dozens of kings, petty and powerful, vied for dominance in an ever-shifting game of power and prestige. Now drop into that chaos a new force, Norse settlers. The Vikings, yes, but not the horned helmet raiders of popular myth. By the 800s and 900s, many Norse had traded in their longboats for ledgers. They built towns, real urban centers like Dublin, and embedded themselves in Ireland's economic networks. They didn't just raid, they stayed. They blended military muscle with maritime commerce, turning ports into power centers. So while some Irish saw the Norse as enemies, others saw opportunity, and some saw both. And into this world steps Brian Boru. Brian wasn't just another king. He was a man on a mission, a man from Munster who sought to do what no other had done, unite the fractious island under a single crown. He didn't just want influence. He wanted dominion. He took the title of High King, and with it, the burden of centralization. That made him a threat not only to Norse interests, but to Irish ones, too. Which brings us to Clontarf. You've probably heard it told as a grand moment of Irish liberation, a noble struggle to cast out foreign rule. But beneath the myth lies a more complicated truth. Clontarf wasn't simply Ireland versus the Norse. It was, at its heart, a civil war. Irish against Irish, with Viking allies on both sides. The rhetoric was nationalist. The reality was messier. So, why does this matter? Because how we tell history shapes what we believe about power, unity, and identity. And sometimes, the real story isn't what we're taught, it's what we're not told. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk systems. Because Clontarf wasn't just about swords and shields, it was a clash between two radically different visions of how a society should be organized. On one side, we have clan-based autonomy, the traditional Irish way. Think of it like a network of overlapping local governments, each rooted in kinship, loyalty, and mutual obligation. Irish clans weren't ruled from the top down. They governed themselves through long-standing ties and deeply personal relationships. Leadership was negotiated, not imposed. Decisions were local. Authority was distributed. And yes, that meant a lot of fighting, but it also meant a fierce protection of independence. This wasn't chaos. It was a kind of order, decentralized, yes, but remarkably resilient. People knew who they were, who they answered to, and who would protect them when things got messy. But Brian Boru? He had another vision. He wanted centralized kingship. Imagine one ruler issuing commands to all, collecting taxes, organizing large military campaigns, building the bones of what we might call a proto-state. His rule came with structure, with order, with efficiency, but also with control. Suddenly, local kings were expected to become vassals. Warriors were drafted into unified armies. Tribute flowed upward, not outward, and many who once ruled their own domains now answered to Brian. The Norse towns? Well, they were something else entirely. Economically savvy, deeply connected to the wider North Sea world, and politically flexible, these Viking settlements enjoyed a kind of urban autonomy. They weren't interested in high kings or clan loyalty. They were interested in trade, wealth, and maritime power. Their elites governed through commerce, not kinship, and they thrived in the space between empires. So what do we get when all of this collides? Systemic tension. Real, structural tension. Because Clontarf wasn't just a battle between people, it was a battle between systems. Decentralized freedom versus centralized authority. Local control versus top-down command. And those tensions didn't end at the battlefield. In many ways, Clontarf is what happens when two incompatible systems try to occupy the same space. And that friction? It would define not just the battle, but the entire legacy of the war to come. So, how did all this come to a head? By the early 1100s, Brian Boru had climbed high. Too high, according to some. His growing authority didn't just irritate his enemies, it alarmed his supposed allies. Because in a system built on mutual autonomy, central power isn't just resented, it's dangerous. And as Brian tried to pull the island into a single orbit, that orbit started to destabilize. Enter Mael Mordor of Leinster, a regional king who had once submitted to Brian, but now saw him not as a unifier, but as a usurper, a man trying to smother the independence of other rulers under a single crown. For Mael Mordor and others like him, resisting Brian wasn't rebellion, it was survival, and resistance wasn't hard to organize, because the Norse in Dublin weren't exactly fans of Brian either. That's where Sigtrygg's Silkbeard comes in. The Norse king of Dublin, born of a Viking father and Irish mother, a hybrid ruler, straddling two worlds. Sigtrygg saw in Leinster a natural ally. Both feared Brian's ambition. Both had something to lose if centralization won. And so, a pact was born, Irish dissidents and Norse merchants, united not by culture, but by calculation. And it didn't stop there. Warriors from Orkney and the Isle of Man joined the coalition, drawn by Norse ties, by promises of spoils, or perhaps by old loyalties. What began as local defiance became something bigger, a pan-Norse, pan-Irish opposition to Brian's model of rule. Now pause for a moment and consider that. Clontarf wasn't a clean-cut war between Ireland and the foreign invader. It was an intersection of competing agendas, a civil war wearing the armor of international conflict. It became a proxy battle, not just for power in Ireland, but for the future of governance on the island. Will it be united under a crown, or divided by tradition? Will trade networks or territorial kingship define its destiny? The pieces were in motion, the players were aligned, and the stage was set for one of the most consequential, and most misunderstood, battles in Irish history. April 23rd, the year 1014. The shores near Clontarf, just outside Dublin, became the site of a cataclysm. Over 7,000 men, Irish, Norse, and others, collided in a brutal storm of hand-to-hand combat. No distant archers, no clean battle lines, just blades, shields, and blood. It was the kind of medieval warfare that left little room for mercy, and even less for survival. The fighting raged from sunrise to sunset. Some sources say the tide turned, literally, with the ocean rising behind the Norse and cutting off their retreat. Imagine that. You're a warrior locked in a desperate fight, and the sea itself becomes a wall behind you. No escape, only death ahead or drowning behind. And when the dust finally settled, Brian Boru's forces won, but only technically, because Brian himself never saw the victory. He was assassinated, not in the thick of battle, but afterward, stabbed in his tent by fleeing Norsemen. It was a chilling end for a man who had tried to unify a fractured island. His death didn't just silence a king, it shattered the very project he had built. This was a Pyrrhic victory, a win that felt more like a loss. The enemy was beaten, but the unifier was gone, and without Brian, the fragile scaffolding of centralized rule began to crumble. Almost immediately, regional kings reasserted control. The efforts toward building a true Irish state, centralized, streamlined, governed from a single throne, were abandoned. The decentralized order, so deeply rooted in Irish tradition, surged back with force. And what about the Norse? Despite their defeat on the battlefield, they endured. Dublin didn't burn. The Norse didn't flee in disgrace. In fact, they doubled down, shifting their influence from battlefield to balance sheet. From warriors to merchants, from conquerors to power brokers, their grip on commerce only deepened. So what are we really left with? A blood-soaked field, a dead high king, a broken vision of unity, and a powerful reminder that a military win doesn't always translate into political triumph. So the battle was over. Brian Boru was dead. The Norse had been defeated on the field. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. In the years that followed, a myth began to take shape, the myth of Brian the Great Unifier. A national hero, a martyr for Ireland, a symbol of resistance and unity. But that image doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny, does it? Because the reality was this: the moment Brian died, the very unity he supposedly embodied unraveled. No smooth transition of power, no enduring central government, just a return to what Ireland had always been: fractured, proud, and fiercely independent. The myth of unity was powerful, but the truth was far more complicated. And what about the Norse? Well, they didn't vanish. Far from it. Dublin remained a major hub of trade, governance, and influence. The Norse continued to intermarry, govern, and deal. They may have lost warriors at Clontarf, but they didn't lose their grip on the economic lifelines of the island. Norse continuity was not a historical hiccup, it was a defining feature of post-Clontarf Ireland. In fact, the outcome of the battle wasn't expulsion, it was hybridization. Rather than purging Viking culture, Ireland absorbed it. Norse practices blended into Irish institutions, legal systems, urban infrastructure, trade customs, all slowly fused. The result? A society that was more mixed, more complex, and in some ways, stronger. Culture, after all, doesn't always yield to swords. Sometimes, it merges. And what of Brian's dream of a top-down state? It failed spectacularly. His push for central control triggered a backlash that only reinforced clan autonomy. His death didn't just end a reign, it reopened the gates for local rule to flourish once more. And so, the momentum toward unification was halted, not by force, but by resistance to overreach. History is filled with people who try to impose order from above. But here, the order fought back. Let's step back for a moment, not to look at battles, kings, or bloodshed, but at systems. Because when the smoke cleared at Clontarf, it wasn't just about who lived or died. It was about which structures survived and which collapsed. First up, centralized fragility. Brian Boru had built a system that worked only when he was alive. He was the sun, and everything orbited around him. But the moment he fell, the political structure he created fell with him. Like a house of cards built on charisma, not foundations. His death exposed just how overdependent his system was on a single figure. And when that figure vanished, so did the whole dream of an Irish state. But look on the other side, at the decentralized systems, the Irish clans, the Norse towns, the networks of mutual obligation and local autonomy. These weren't glamorous, they weren't tidy, but they were resilient. When leaders died, the systems adapted, authority shifted, trade continued, alliances evolved. These models had depth, not just height. They weren't built to impress, they were built to last. And something else happened, too, something subtle, but powerful. Organic integration, not by force, but by contact. As Norse and Irish communities interacted, they blended voluntarily. Systems merged at the ground level, not by decree. That kind of fusion creates social cohesion, less friction, more flexibility. It wasn't top-down control, it was bottom-up synthesis. But here's the real kicker, the part most histories leave out. Statecraft cuts both ways. Efforts to unify, to centralize, to dominate, they often trigger the opposite of their intention. Brian tried to unite Ireland. In doing so, he sparked rebellion, deepened fractures, and ultimately re-empowered the very forces he meant to absorb. There's a lesson here, not just for medieval kings, but for anyone trying to reshape a system. Push too hard from above, and you might break the very thing you're trying to build. So now that we've traveled through the chaos, the systems, and the myths, what's left? Well, something history class rarely gives you. Ambiguity, complexity, truth that resists tidy endings. The Battle of Clontarf is often served up as a clean victory. Ireland triumphs over the Vikings. A glorious moment of national unity. A legendary king defeats the foreign threat. But the truth, it's far messier, and far more human. Brian Boru was brilliant, but also flawed. His ambition lifted Ireland, and fractured it. The Norse weren't just invaders, they were neighbors, traders, even kin. The so-called foreign threat wasn't really foreign, and the so-called Irish victory wasn't really a win. What Clontarf gives us is a mirror, one that reflects back the dangers of forcing unity, of oversimplifying enemies, of mistaking control for stability. Because in the end, what endured wasn't the centralized kingdom. It was the decentralized networks, the local customs, the economic partnerships, the fusion of systems and cultures that adapted, even thrived, outside the grasp of any single throne. That's the part history often glosses over. But here, we don't gloss, we dig. Because history isn't a slogan, it's a story, layered, conflicted, sometimes ugly, always revealing. And if you've enjoyed that kind of story, one that challenges, questions, and reveals what really happened, then do me a favor. Like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. It helps more people discover the untold sides of the past. And if you want to take this episode with you, check out the podcast version in the description below. We've got plenty more videos coming your way. If you like this one, you'll love what's next. Thanks for watching, and remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, if you know what to listen for.